The crystal shattered against the mahogany wall, silencing the five-star dining room instantly. The most feared man in Chicago had a terrified waitress pinned by her collar, his eyes locked desperately on her throat. "That necklace!" he roared, his voice trembling with a terrifying grief. "Belonged to my dead wife." Vincent Romano did not dine. He held court. As the undisputed head of the Romano syndicate, his presence in the Obsidian Room, Chicago's most exclusive, impenetrable culinary fortress, was an event that dictated the breathing patterns of everyone in the building. Tonight, however, the heavy atmosphere was suffocating for a different reason. It was October 14th, exactly 2 years since his wife, Isabella, had been pulled from the burning wreckage of her Mercedes on a lonely stretch of the Pacific Coast Highway. The official police report called it a tragic accident. A blown tire, a steep cliff, a rainy night. Vincent had accepted it, because the alternative was tearing the city apart brick by brick. Since that night, he had become a ghost of a man, ruling his empire not with the calculated charm he was once known for, but with a cold, ruthless detachment. He sat in the secluded corner booth, flanked by his 2 most trusted shadows. Bruno, a towering enforcer with the warmth of a cinder block, and Silas, his slick, silver-tongued underboss, who had seamlessly stepped in to manage the syndicate's front businesses after Isabella's passing. Across the dining room, Lydia Harrison was merely trying to survive the shift. Lydia was 24, chronically exhausted, and carrying the weight of a crushing $500,000 medical debt left behind by her father's terminal illness. She worked 3 jobs, but the Obsidian Room was the one that paid the rent. The rules here were simple. Speak only when spoken to, pour the wine without spilling a drop, and never, under any circumstances, make eye contact with the men in the corner booths. Lydia was a professional, but tonight, she was frantic. She had arrived late, rushing from her daytime shift at a bakery, and barely had time to change into her pressed black uniform. In her haste, she forgot to clasp her high-collared shirt all the way to the top. More importantly, she had forgotten to take off the heavy, ornate silver chain resting against her collarbone. "Table 4, Mr. Beaumont, the maitre d', hissed, shoving a silver tray carrying a bottle of 1990 Louis Roederer crystal into Lydia's trembling hands. "Romano's table. Do not mess this up, Lydia. He's in a foul mood." Lydia nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. She approached the corner booth with practiced grace. Vincent was staring into the middle distance, twisting a heavy gold wedding band around his finger. Silas was murmuring something about shipping manifestos, while Bruno scanned the room like a hawk. "Good evening, gentlemen," Lydia said softly, keeping her eyes fixed on the stemware as she began to uncork the vintage champagne. Vincent didn't look at her. He waved a dismissive hand, authorizing her to pour. Lydia leaned forward over the table to reach Vincent's glass. As she did, gravity took hold. The heavy silver chain slipped out from beneath the fabric of her uniform collar, dangling directly in Vincent's line of sight. At the end of the chain hung a pendant, a breathtaking, custom-cut blue sapphire, surrounded by a halo of crushed black diamonds set in oxidized platinum. It was a one-of-a-kind piece, designed by a master jeweler in Milan. Vincent's breathing stopped. The world seemed to downshift into agonizing slow motion. For 2 years, Vincent had searched for that necklace. Isabella had been wearing it the night she died, but it was conspicuously missing from the crash site. The police had assumed it melted in the fire or was thrown into the ocean. Yet here it was, perfectly intact, hanging from the neck of a stranger serving him alcohol. "Where?" Vincent's voice was barely a whisper, a raspy exhalation of shock. Then, the grief and betrayal mutated instantly into blinding, explosive rage. Before Lydia could comprehend what was happening, Vincent's large hand shot across the table. He grabbed the front of her uniform collar, hauling her forward with such terrifying force that the tray of crystal crashed to the floor, the champagne exploding in a froth of glass and expensive foam. Screams erupted from the adjacent tables. Patrons scrambled out of their chairs. Bruno and Silas were on their feet in a microsecond, their hands resting on the concealed weapons beneath their jackets, eyes scanning for an assassin. But the threat wasn't a hitman. Vincent stood up, lifting Lydia until she was forced to stand on her tiptoes, his knuckles brushing against the cold sapphire. "Where did you get this?" Vincent roared, the sound tearing through the elegant dining room like a gunshot. The crystal from a nearby wall sconce literally shattered from the violent impact of his fist slamming against the wood paneling. "That necklace belonged to my dead wife. Tell me who you stole it from, or I swear to God, you will not leave this room alive." Lydia was paralyzed, her lungs burning as the fabric tightened around her neck. The sheer, primal fury in Vincent Romano's eyes was the most terrifying thing she had ever witnessed. She could smell the expensive cologne on him, mixed with the metallic tang of adrenaline. "Boss," Silas cautioned, stepping forward, his eyes darting nervously around the restaurant. "People are watching. Let the girl go. We can take her to the back room and handle this quietly." "I don't care who is watching," Vincent bellowed, tears of raw, unadulterated pain pricking the corners of his eyes. He shook Lydia slightly. "Speak! Did you grave rob my wife? Did you pull this off her body?" Lydia's hands flew to Vincent's wrist, not to fight him, but to stabilize herself. She looked directly into the eyes of the deadliest man in the city. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. Instead, a strange, desperate calm washed over her. "I didn't steal it," Lydia choked out, her voice raspy but astonishingly steady. "Liar," Vincent hissed, tightening his grip. "It went missing the night she died in that car crash." Lydia swallowed hard, her eyes shifting for a fraction of a second to the men standing behind Vincent, specifically landing on the slick, immaculately dressed underboss, Silas. "She didn't die in a car crash, Mr. Romano," Lydia said, the words cutting through the chaotic noise of the restaurant like a scythe. "And she told me if I ever needed your protection from the men who really killed her, I should wear it to the Obsidian Room on October 14th. Silence, heavier and far more dangerous than the shouting, descended upon the corner booth. Vincent froze. The grip on Lydia's collar loosened just a fraction, enough for her to drag a ragged breath into her lungs. His dark eyes darted over her face, searching for deception, searching for madness. "What did you just say?" Vincent whispered, his voice dangerously low. "Boss, she's a junkie or a thief, trying to save her own skin," Silas interrupted, stepping closer. His voice was smooth, but there was a sudden, unnatural tightness to his posture. "Let Bruno take her downstairs. I'll make her talk. She's disrespecting Isabella's memory." "Shut up, Silas," Vincent snapped, not breaking eye contact with Lydia. He slowly opened his hand, letting Lydia stumble back onto her own 2 feet. She rubbed her reddened neck, coughing softly, but she didn't try to run. She stood her ground amidst the shattered glass and spilled champagne. "You have exactly 1 minute to explain yourself," Vincent said, his tone devoid of all emotion now. It was the voice he used right before ordering an execution. "If I find a single hole in your story, you're dead." 2 years ago, Lydia began, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "I wasn't working here. I was working the graveyard shift at a 24-hour diner off Route 66, near the county line. It was pouring rain. Around 2 a.m., the bell on the door rang." Vincent stared at her, mesmerized despite himself. The details matched. The crash site was 5 miles from that diner. "A woman walked in," Lydia continued, her eyes glistening as the memory flooded back. "She was beautiful, wearing a silk trench coat. but she was soaked to the bone, and she was bleeding, heavily. She had a massive wound on her side. It wasn't from a car crash, Mr. Romano. It was a gunshot wound. Vincent felt the blood drain from his face. No. The coroner's report was bought and paid for, Lydia said flatly. She collapsed into one of my booths. I locked the front door and ran to get the first aid kit. I wanted to call an ambulance, but she grabbed my wrist. She was so strong, even though she was dying. She begged me not to call the police or the paramedics. She said, "They own them. They'll finish the job." Vincent's breath hitched. They. She knew she wasn't going to make it, Lydia whispered, a single tear escaping and tracking down her cheek. She took this necklace off. She pressed it into my hand. She told me her name was Isabella. She told me she was running away because she found ledgers. Ledgers that proved someone inside your family was skimming millions, and worse, selling weapons to your rivals in the triad. "That's a lie," Silas barked, taking a sudden step toward Lydia. "Vincent, she's making this up. She read about the crash in the papers." "Did the papers mention the necklace?" Vincent shot back, raising a hand to stop Silas in his tracks. Vincent looked back at Lydia. "Go on." "She said she was trying to get the ledgers to you, but she was intercepted on the highway. They shot her, ran her car off the road to make it look like an accident. But she managed to crawl out before it exploded and walked the 5 miles to my diner through the woods." Lydia took a deep breath. "She died on the floor of my diner, Mr. Romano. But before she did, she told me who shot her. The tension in the room snapped taut, like a wire about to break. "Who?" Vincent demanded, the word carrying the weight of an anvil. Lydia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, blood-stained, leather-bound notebook. It was battered, the pages wrinkled from water damage, but the gold-embossed R on the cover was still visible. "She told me to hide this," Lydia said, her hand shaking as she held the notebook out. "She said, 'Give this to Vincent, but only when you are sure you are safe.' I didn't know who you were. I was terrified. When I saw the news the next day about the tragic accident, I realized how powerful the people who killed her were. I hid the notebook. I buried it." "Why tonight?" Vincent asked, taking the bloody notebook from her hands. His fingers brushed the dried, brown stains, his wife's blood. "Why bring it out now, 2 years later?" "Because," Lydia said, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper as she looked past Vincent, straight into the eyes of the man standing behind him. "Because 2 days ago, men broke into my apartment. They tore it apart looking for something. I barely escaped through the fire escape. I realized they finally tracked me down." I remembered Isabella's words. "If they ever come for you, put on the necklace. Go to the Obsidian Room on October 14th. My husband will be there. It's our anniversary. He never misses it." Lydia pointed a trembling finger. "She told me the man who shot her smiled when he pulled the trigger. She said he had a silver scar running through his left eyebrow." Vincent slowly, mechanically, turned his head. His eyes locked onto Silas. Silas, his trusted underboss. Silas, who had managed the finances perfectly for 2 years. Silas, who had a faint, silver scar cutting through his left eyebrow. The color vanished from Silas's face. He took a slow step backward, his hand inching toward the inside of his tailored suit jacket. "Boss. Vinny, you can't believe this trash. It's a setup." Vincent didn't yell. He didn't throw a punch. The blinding rage from earlier had evaporated, replaced by a cold, dead winter that was infinitely more terrifying. He looked down at the blood-stained ledger in his hand, then back up at the man he had called a brother. "Bruno," Vincent said softly. Before Silas could draw his weapon, Bruno's massive hand clamped down on his wrist, twisting it until a sickening snap echoed over the shattered glass. Silas dropped to his knees, howling in pain, his gun clattering across the floor. Vincent turned back to the waitress. Lydia stood there, breathing hard, the sapphire glowing against her skin under the dim emergency lights that had flickered on. She had just blown the absolute center of the Chicago underworld wide open. "You kept her secret for 2 years," Vincent murmured, stepping closer to Lydia, the terrifying Mafia boss suddenly looking like a broken, devastated husband. "You kept her safe. At the end. I held her hand until she was gone," Lydia whispered. Vincent closed his eyes, a shudder racking his broad shoulders. When he opened them, the ghost was gone. The King of Chicago was back, and he was looking at Lydia not as a waitress, but as a savior. "Mr. Beaumont," Vincent called out, not turning around. The terrified manager crept out from behind the bar. Yes, Mr. Romano." "Lydia no longer works here," Vincent said, his voice echoing in the silent room. He gently reached out and touched the clasp of the necklace, securing it firmly around Lydia's neck. "She works for me now, and God help the man who looks at her the wrong way." The ride to the Romano estate was suffocatingly silent. The bulletproof windows of the black armored SUV separated Lydia from the neon blur of the Chicago skyline, sealing her inside a world she had only ever seen in nightmares. She sat in the cavernous back seat, the heavy sapphire pendant feeling like a physical anchor against her chest. Beside her, Vincent Romano was a statue carved from ice. He held the water-damaged, blood-stained ledger in his lap with a reverence bordering on religious. He didn't open it. Not yet. He simply traced the embossed R on the leather cover, his jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to fracture. Up front, Bruno drove with white-knuckled intensity, the radio turned off, the only sound the low hum of the massive engine. The underboss, the man who had smiled as he pulled the trigger on Isabella Romano, was not in the car. He had been thrown into the trunk of a secondary vehicle by Bruno's men, his shattered wrist hastily bound with zip ties. He was being transported to a place the syndicate quietly referred to as the abattoir, a soundproofed warehouse in the industrial district where debts of blood were paid. When they arrived at the sprawling, gated compound on the edge of Lake Michigan, Lydia was ushered inside by a perimeter of armed guards. The estate was breathtakingly beautiful, but overwhelmingly cold. High-vaulted ceilings, imported Italian marble, and shadows that seemed to stretch too long across the floors. "Take her to the East Wing," Vincent instructed a quiet, grey-haired housekeeper who materialized in the foyer. "Give her whatever she needs. No one enters her corridor without my explicit permission. Is that understood?" "Yes, Mr. Romano," the housekeeper murmured, leading a bewildered Lydia away. Vincent didn't wait to watch her go. He walked straight into his private study, locked the heavy oak doors, and poured himself 3 fingers of scotch. He didn't drink it. He set the glass on his mahogany desk, turned on a single brass reading lamp, and finally, with trembling hands, opened his wife's ledger. The handwriting was unmistakably Isabella's, elegant, looping cursive, though the final pages were jagged and frantic, written by a woman bleeding to death in a roadside diner. As Vincent read, the full, horrifying scope of the betrayal crystallized. The underboss hadn't just skimmed a few $1,000s, he had orchestrated a massive, systematic hemorrhaging of the Romano syndicate's assets. Millions had been funneled through shell corporations, specifically a private consulting firm registered in Belize called Apex Global Logistics. But the money was only the beginning. The underboss had been funding the Rossi family, Vincent's most bitter rivals, effectively arming the enemy. Isabella, brilliant and sharp-eyed, had noticed discrepancies in the shipping manifests. When she dug deeper, she uncovered wire transfers to a private military contractor known for untraceable wet work. "He knows I found the accounts," Isabella's frantic scrawl read on the penultimate page. "He tried to corner me at the gallery today." His eyes. "Vincent, he's going to make a move. I have all the routing numbers. I'm bringing them to you tonight." The final entry was written in a different pen, the ink smeared with dried blood. "I didn't make it, V. He was waiting on the highway. I love you. Avenge us." Vincent closed the book. The silence in the study was absolute. He didn't scream. He didn't break anything. The raging inferno of grief had burned away, leaving only the cold, hard steel of a man who was about to orchestrate the most spectacular destruction the Chicago underworld had ever witnessed. An hour later, Vincent stood in the freezing basement of the abattoir. The underboss hung by his wrists from a heavy iron chain attached to the ceiling, his tailored suit ruined, his face bruised and swollen from Bruno's initial interrogation. "Vincent!" the traitor choked out, blood dripping from his chin. "Vinny, please! We grew up together. She was paranoid. She made it up." Vincent walked slowly into the harsh glare of the overhead bulb, holding a thick sheaf of printed banking documents. "Apex Global Logistics," Vincent said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Account number ending in 8842, $64 million. You didn't just steal from me. You stole from the Triad shipments we were holding in escrow." The underboss's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. Stealing from Vincent was a death sentence. Stealing from the Triad was an eternity of torture. "You took my heart," Vincent whispered, stepping close enough to look into the eyes of his wife's murderer. "So I am going to take everything from you." Vincent didn't raise a hand. He didn't have to. He looked over his shoulder at Bruno. "Transfer the $64 million to the St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Isabella's name," Vincent ordered coldly. "And then, open the loading dock doors. The Triad emissaries are waiting outside. Tell them the Romano family caught a rat chewing on their grain, and we are handing him over as a gesture of continued friendship." The underboss began to scream, thrashing violently against the chains as the heavy metal doors of the warehouse began to grind open, revealing the shadowy figures waiting in the rainy alleyway. Vincent turned his back and walked away, letting the screams fade into the roaring thunder outside. The hardest karma was not a bullet. It was being handed to the monsters you thought you could outsmart. 6 months passed. The chill of October had given way to the soft, thawing breezes of April, and the Romano syndicate had been ruthlessly purged and rebuilt. Using the information in Isabella's ledger, Vincent systematically dismantled the Rossi family's operations, cutting off their supply lines and seizing their territories without firing a single shot, simply by bankrupting their fronts. Inside the Romano estate, the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The suffocating ghost of grief that had haunted the halls for 2 years was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused energy. And at the center of this transformation was Lydia. She had not returned to her cramped apartment, nor had she gone back to pouring champagne at the Obsidian Room. The morning after the incident, Vincent had handed her a document from his lawyers. Her $500,000 medical debt had been wiped entirely clean. "You bought my life back," she had told him, standing in his study, her voice thick with emotion. "You handed me my life back," he had replied softly. "You are under my protection now. You leave when you want, you stay if you wish. But you will never want for anything again." Lydia chose to stay. She started by organizing the estate's chaotic library, then moved on to helping Vincent's legitimate accountants sort through the massive restructuring of his public businesses. It turned out the girl who had spent years balancing 3 jobs and navigating crippling debt had a savant-like ability to spot numerical anomalies. She became indispensable, an advisor who spoke to the King of Chicago, not with fear, but with an unwavering, honest clarity. They found themselves spending evenings in the study, a crackling fire warming the room. The trauma that had violently thrust them together forged a profound, unspoken bond. Vincent found himself captivated, not just by her bravery, but by her resilience. She had held his dying wife, but instead of letting the darkness consume her, she had fought to survive. Late one Thursday night, Lydia was poring over the final, water-damaged pages of the ledger. She frowned, tapping a pencil against her chin. "Vincent," she called out. He looked up from his laptop, his dark eyes instantly softening as they met hers. "Look at this margin note." Isabella wrote a sequence of letters. TRPDCC. Vincent walked over, leaning over her shoulder. He could smell her subtle vanilla perfume. "I had my cryptographers look at that months ago. They couldn't crack it. They assumed it was a dead drop code." "It's not a code," Lydia said, her eyes widening as the realization hit her. "I remember the night she came into the diner." She was muttering to herself, delirious from the blood loss. She kept saying, "The rot is at the top. The precinct." Vincent. TRPDCC. Lydia grabbed a blank sheet of paper and wrote it out rapidly. "Thomas Reed, Police Department, City Commissioner." Vincent froze. Commissioner Thomas Reed was the man who had personally overseen the investigation into Isabella's crash. He was the one who had signed off on the accidental death ruling, sealing the records. He was the inside man, Vincent breathed, his voice dropping to a dangerous octave. He covered up the assassination for a cut of the stolen triad money. "If you kill him, the city will go to war," Lydia warned, turning in her chair to face him. She didn't flinch from the sudden darkness in his eyes. She anchored him. "He's too high profile." Vincent looked down at her, the corners of his mouth lifting into a faint, predatory smile. "I'm not going to kill him, Lydia. I'm going to do to him exactly what he did to my wife. I'm going to bury him." Within 48 hours, the city of Chicago was rocked by the largest corruption scandal in its history. Anonymous packages containing irrefutable bank records, offshore wire transfers, and audio recordings extracted from the underboss's hidden safe were delivered simultaneously to the FBI, the mayor's office, and every major news outlet in the state. Commissioner Thomas Reed was arrested in the middle of a televised charity gala, dragged out in handcuffs as the cameras flashed. He was stripped of his badge, his pension, and his freedom, facing life in federal prison among the very criminals he had double-crossed. The rot had finally been excised. On the evening of the anniversary of Isabella's funeral, Vincent and Lydia stood together at the private Romano mausoleum. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the pristine marble. Vincent placed a bouquet of white lilies at the foot of the crypt. He stood in silence for a long time, the heavy burden of vengeance finally lifted from his shoulders. When he turned back to Lydia, the wind caught her hair, illuminated by the fading light. She was still wearing the sapphire necklace. Vincent reached out, his warm fingers brushing against the nape of her neck. Gently, he unclasped the heavy silver chain. Lydia looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat, confused. "Isabella gave this to you to save your life," Vincent said softly, pulling the necklace away and slipping it into his pocket. "It served its purpose. It brought you to me. But it belongs to the past." He reached into his other pocket, and pulled out a delicate velvet box. He snapped it open. Inside rested a breathtaking, teardrop diamond pendant, suspended on a chain of rose gold. It wasn't loud or imposing. It was elegant, pure, and entirely new. "This," Vincent whispered, stepping closer, his chest brushing against hers as he fastened the new necklace around her neck. "Belongs to the future." Lydia reached up, her fingers grazing the cool diamond, a tear slipping down her cheek, not of sorrow, but of profound relief. She looked up into the eyes of the most feared man in Chicago, and for the first time in 2 years, she saw a man who was completely, utterly at peace. He leaned down, and as their lips finally met in the quiet twilight, the ghosts of the past faded away, leaving only the fierce, unbreakable promise of tomorrow. Vincent Romano's world was shattered by a necklace, but rebuilt by the brave waitress who returned it. Lydia didn't just deliver the truth about Isabella's tragic fate. She brought a dead man back to life. Their story proves that the darkest betrayals can forge the strongest bonds.